You may have heard the saying, "When I get rich, I'll buy a Rolex." But have you ever wondered why Rolex is so special, why it is so expensive, and why successful people want one? Today's story is about one of the most iconic names in the world, Rolex. Welcome to our channel, English Avenue. We're going to take you on a journey that is not only inspirational but also luxurious. It begins with a dream, grows with vision, and becomes a symbol of success, elegance, and perfection. To wear it, and why it's more than just a watch but a symbol of something much greater because. In reality, Rolex is more than just a watch, it's a story, a dream, an emotion, and it's not worn to indicate the passing of time, rather, it's worn to indicate that your time has come. We'll go over every detail, including why Rolex is so costly, why it's a wise investment, why it's limited, and why people associate it with success and wealth. Most importantly, we'll look at how Rolex began at zero and rose to become the most prestigious watch brand in the world. English with this story, but you'll also feel inspired, motivated, and emotionally connected to a journey that began over a century ago. Let's go back to 1881 in the German town of Kumbach, where a baby boy named Hans Wilsdorf was born. Hans wasn't born into a wealthy family. In fact, his life was extremely difficult from the start. When he was just 12 years old, something extremely painful happened to him. Yes. He lost both of his parents, making him an orphan at that age. When Hans was around 19, he began working in a Swiss watch company that didn't make watches but exported them to other nations. So he was learning. With no father to guide him, he was sent to a boarding school in Switzerland, where his life began to change gradually. He was very intelligent, curious, and disciplined. But more than anything, he was a dreamer who used to look up at the sky and think, "One day, I will do something big that the whole world will remember." He was studying the business of time minute by minute. He learned how watches are made, what makes a watch good or bad, why people prefer certain brands over others, how to pack watches, and how to deal with customers. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever worked a job that was small but you gave it your all? Hans was not the boss or wealthy, but he worked like a king, respecting time and his work, and gradually that work began to respect him back. Let's fast forward a few years, and Hans moved to London in 1903. At the age of 22, he had a big dream. He wanted to start a watch company that was different. He didn't want to make another watch. Instead, he wanted to make the most respected and trusted watch in the world. In 1905, Hans Wilsdorf and his partner Alfred Davis founded Wilsdorf and Davis in London. This was the first step. They weren't even making watches at first. They were importing watch movements and inner parts from Switzerland, putting them in strong elegant cases and selling them in London. They aimed to provide people with high-quality watches at affordable prices. Gradually, people began to take notice of their products, but Hans was not content. He wanted a name that was simple to say, easy to remember, and elegant in all languages. He tried hundreds of names, some of which were too long and some of which were difficult to pronounce. But one day in 1908, while he was riding in a horse-drawn carriage, the name suddenly came to him like a whisper, Rolex. Short, strong, and stylish, he repeated the word Rolex once more. It sounded like a watch ticking, powerful and ideal, and in that moment, in that simple horse-drawn carriage, a legend was born. In 1908, Hans officially registered the name Rolex in Switzerland, marking the beginning of a brand that would change history. However, things were not easy at first because Hans wanted to create a watch that people could wear on their wrist. You might ask, what's so new in that? Since most men use wristwatches today, however, Hans Wilsdorf saw something that no one else could see. He saw the future, a time when people would want convenience. A time when they would want a watch on their wrist that was always visible and accessible. Pocket watches were considered feminine for women, and men used to carry them in their coat pockets. They would take the watch out of their waistcoat, check the time, and then tuck it back in. In order for men to accept wristwatches, it was obvious that the watch needed to be flawless, not just fashionable or small, and accurate, durable, and strong enough to withstand the rigors of a man's everyday life. However, in 1908, technology was not very advanced, and most wristwatches lost time, gained time, or stopped working after being exposed to dust or water. Hans didn't want just another watch. Instead, he wanted to create something that people could rely on with their lives, so he began working with the top Swiss watchmakers. He started creating wristwatches that were not only exquisite but also incredibly accurate. Each gear, spring, and tiny screw inside the Rolex watch was meticulously designed with love and patience. Hans Wilsdorf would spend days testing the watches to see how they functioned in a variety of temperatures, humid conditions, and inclement weather. Then, in 1910, one of the most significant moments in his journey occurred when he sent one of his Rolex wristwatches to the Swiss office for people said that wristwatches could never be accurate enough. But Hans thought otherwise. After weeks of testing, the Swiss authorities were shocked to learn that this small Rolex wristwatch was incredibly accurate. For the first time in history, a wristwatch received the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision. This office tested watches for accuracy at the time, and only large marine chronometers used in ships would pass those tests. The world took a dark turn in 1914 when World War I broke out. This war affected not only nations but also people's trust, emotions, and businesses. Hans's German heritage was suddenly viewed as a foreign enemy in England, despite the fact that he had worked so hard there. Many English customers stopped trusting German companies because they didn't understand Hans's heart and didn't care that he believed in quality, honesty, and innovation. They merely saw his passport. Hans took a risk by moving Rolex from England to Switzerland, which remained neutral during the war. It was painful to leave behind the place where his dream had blossomed. But it was vital to safeguard Rolex's future. In 1914, after relocating to Switzerland to safeguard his dream during World War I, Hans didn't stop. He swiftly established a new base for Rolex there using Switzerland's reputation for superior watchmaking. Despite the war, he sent another Rolex wristwatch was sent to the Kew Observatory in England, which tested timepieces for the Royal Navy. Their standards were even higher, and they would test watches in 5 different positions over several days in a variety of temperatures. Everyone thought a small wristwatch could never pass, but Hansville's dwarf once again stunned the world by receiving a Class A precision certificate, which was previously only given to marine chronometers. People began to take notice, and the world began to pay attention, but now came the next challenge. Hansdorff knew that accuracy alone was insufficient. A man's wristwatch needed to withstand everyday wear, dust, sweat, rain, accidental splashes, and possibly even falling into water. Most watches at the time would malfunction if even a tiny bit of moisture got inside, so he started working with engineers, watchmakers, and inventors to create a case. The world's first waterproof and dustproof wristwatch, the Rolex Oyster, was created in 1926 after numerous unsuccessful attempts, sleepless nights, and experiments. Imagine this watch. It had a screw-down crown, a hermetically sealed case, a revolutionary design that had never been seen before, and a special case that locked tightly like an oyster shell, hence the name Oyster, protecting the movement inside from water and dust. A young English woman named Mercedes Glitza decided to swim across the English Channel in 1927. The English Channel is a long stretch of cold, rough water between England and France. It takes hours to swim across it, and most people never make it. However, Mercedes was brave, determined, and prepared. Hans saw this as a great opportunity, so he gave her a Rolex Oyster. It had been seen before, but even now people were skeptical and didn't think it was truly waterproof. People laughed when they asked her to wear the watch while swimming, saying, "The watch will die before she does." Hans, however, remained silent and waited until Mercedes entered the icy waters. She swam for over 10 hours, during which time the Rolex Oyster remained on her wrist. When she emerged, shivering and exhausted, Hans checked the watch to make sure it was still functioning flawlessly and that not a drop of water had entered the case. This incident became well known throughout the world, and newspapers printed headlines like Hans Todorf made sure that everyone saw the watch that defied the sea by placing large advertisements on the front pages of major newspapers that showed the Rolex Oyster and the Mercedes Glitza story. People were shocked, amazed, and curious because, at that point, Rolex was more than just a watch. It was a feat of engineering, a testament to dependability, and a symbol of bravery, perseverance, and innovation. From that point on, Rolex began to transform from a product into a lifestyle, a dream, and a status symbol, and people began to say, "If you want to show success, wear." But Hans wasn't finished. He had another dream. He wanted to make a watch that wound itself. You see, most mechanical watches at the time needed to be wound manually every day. You had to take the crown, twist it, and wind it to keep it running. If you forgot to wind it, the watch would stop. Hans wanted to solve that problem, so he wanted to make a watch that wound itself with the motion of the wrist. In 1931, Rolex unveiled the first self-winding mechanism in history, which had a perpetual rotor, utilizing the natural movement of your wrist to keep you from twisting or forgetting. This invention became the basis for contemporary automatic watches. By this point, Rolex had not only transformed the market but also shaped the future. It was started by an orphan boy who had lost everything but had never given up hope. In 1939, World War II broke out. And although Switzerland remained neutral, Hans Wilsdorf could sense that the world was once again filled with pain, destruction, and fear. Hans did something incredibly inspirational when he said, "If you are in prison and want a Rolex, I'll send it. Don't worry about the money now, pay me later when you're free." Despite the suffering all around him, many of his customers and employees were from countries that were now at war with one another. Then, something incredible happened. British soldiers who were captured and made prisoners in German camps had lost everything, including their watches. More than 3,000 inmates were given Rolex watches. Hans did not do this for financial gain, rather, he did it to give them hope because he thought that even in the most hopeless situations, time and dignity matter. This was a human decision rather than a business one, and as a result, Rolex became more than just a brand, it became a symbol of bravery, trust, and humanity. Following the success of the Oyster and the development of the perpetual self-winding movement, Rolex had already begun to surpass its competitors. But Hans Wilsdorf wanted to demonstrate more than just selling watches. Hans came up with a brilliant idea. He thought that the best way to test a watch was to take it into the most extreme places on Earth, like deep oceans, high mountains, freezing temperatures, and blazing deserts. If a Rolex could survive those places, then it could survive anywhere and more than survive. He believed that Rolex was a watch of achievement, of pushing boundaries, of going where no one else had gone. He knew that his watches were strong, accurate, waterproof, and self-winding. In the early 1950s, a group of courageous climbers decided to do something that had never been done before and reached the summit of Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world at 8,848 meters, 29 feet, above sea level. It was cold, dangerous, and deadly, and many climbers had died trying to reach the top. As a result, Rolex watches started going on amazing adventures, not as decorations, but as reliable tools. Let's start with one of the most famous journeys in human history. Sir Edmund Hillary from New Zealand and Tenzing Norgay, a Sherpa from Nepal, were on top of the world on May 29, 1953. They had to deal with freezing temperatures, oxygen shortages, strong winds, and treacherous slopes, but guess what? They were wearing a Rolex Oyster Perpetual Explorer on their wrists. The watch continued to tick as the two men planted their feet on top of the world, and it didn't stop. The Rolex was beating with their triumphant human hearts. This was more than just an advertisement, it was a message to the world that Rolex is not afraid of any during the 1950s. As more and more people started exploring the ocean depths, Rolex had its sights set on the deep sea. As a result, the company created a special model to honor the mission, called the Rolex Explorer. It was designed specifically for adventurers and extreme explorers and featured a clear, readable dial, strong, luminous hands, and a tough case. It was simple, bold, and powerful. Just like the people who wore it while Rolex was climbing mountains. Keep perfect time, so Rolex began working on a new project to create a professional diver's watch. In 1953, the year Everest was conquered, Rolex released the renowned Rolex Submariner, the first wristwatch in history to be waterproof to a depth of 100 meters, 330 feet. This was a huge deal because most watches would die in a swimming pool, but Rolex continued to improve the design, creating stronger seals, more resistant cases, and eventually even more sophisticated diving watches, such as the C located in the deep sea and capable of withstanding depths of up to 3,900 meters, 12,800 feet. The Submariner was not only technically sophisticated but also aesthetically pleasing. With its black dial, rotating bezel, and glowing hour markers, it became a symbol of fashion and celebrities. James Bond, starting with Sean Connery in Dr. No, 1962, or the Submariner, which is now one of the most sought-after timepieces on the planet. Moving on from the deep ocean to the world of racing. Rolex focused on automobiles in the 1960s. In 1963, Rolex introduced the Cosmograph Daytona, a watch designed for professional racing drivers. Named after Daytona Beach in Florida, USA. A well-known location for auto racing, the Daytona had a stunning design, strong durability, and a tachymeter scale on the bezel to measure speed. It was bold and precise. But at first it didn't sell well, and people didn't understand it for years. The Daytona stayed in the background until something extraordinary occurred. The world noticed that Paul Newman, a well-known Hollywood actor and real-life race car driver, was wearing a Rolex Daytona. His personal Daytona became so well-known that it was sold at auction for $17.8 million in 2017, making it one of the most expensive watches ever sold. Today, the Rolex Daytona is one of the most sought-after timepieces in the world. It symbolizes speed and elegance. And the brand's legacy wasn't limited to climbers and divers. Rolex introduced the Day-Date, a very special watch, in 1956. It was the first watch in history to display the date and the day of the week written in full on the dial. This may seem ordinary today, but in 1956 it was revolutionary. The watch was opulent. Made entirely of 18-karat gold or platinum, and came with a special bracelet called the President Bracelet that was made just for this model. Over time, many presidents and world leaders, including U.S. presidents like Lyndon B. Johnson, wore this watch. Johnson, which is why the Day-Date became known as the President's Watch. It was more than just a timepiece. It was a symbol of sophistication, power, and respect. Now, for one of the most astounding feats in Rolex history, in 1960, a deep-sea submersible named Trieste descended to the Mariana Trench, which is located at a depth of 10,916 meters, 35,814 feet, below the surface, deeper than Mount Everest. Rolex made a unique experimental watch, which they attached to the exterior of the Rolex Deep Sea Special, was still functioning flawlessly after the Trieste returned, not broken or delayed, just ticking as if nothing had happened. That's the power of Rolex. It was more than just a name now, it was a symbol of what it means to be perfect, luxurious, accurate, and classy. However, most people make the mistake of believing that Rolex's journey was over once it became famous. The pressure at that depth is crushing, more than 1,000 times greater than at sea level. So no normal object can survive. No, the truth is that after Rolex became well known, their real battle began because everyone was watching them, every luxury brand wanted to imitate them. And every critic waited for them to make a mistake. Hans Wilsdorf had one clear rule in mind. A Rolex watch must not only look flawless but also function flawlessly even under the most trying circumstances. For this reason, Rolex was not only making beautiful watches. They were also building machines and tools for survivors. Let's examine the philosophy behind the scenes timeless design. Rolex didn't follow trends. In fact, some of their most well-known models, including the Submariner, Datejust, and Day-Date, haven't changed their appearance in decades. This is because classic beauty never goes out of style, and each Rolex watch is built like a tank. It is tested under extreme pressure, heat, water, and dust, and some watches are tested in destruction chambers. Yes, Rolex destroys hundreds of watches annually to check their limits in-house. But most watch brands purchase parts. The reason Rolex is the luxury status symbol is because they make everything in-house. From the gold they melt to the screws inside the movement to the special lubricants used inside the gears. This gives them complete control over quality and silent mastery. Rolex doesn't shout, doesn't do crazy marketing stunts, and doesn't need celebrities to beg for attention. In fact, Rolex quietly supports science, art exploration, and deep-sea diving because it believes in action rather than noise. Let's talk about some things that only the most inquisitive minds ever learn. Why you can't buy a Rolex just because you have money, why Rolex is the only watch in the world that gets more expensive over time, why billionaires, kings, rappers, scientists, and divers all love the same brand, and why Rolex remains untouchable even in the modern world of smart watches and fast fashion. Most people believe that, if I had $10,000, I could walk into a Rolex showroom. However, if you were to walk into a Rolex store tomorrow with cash in hand and ask, "I want a Submariner," they would smile and politely respond, "Sorry, Sir/Madam, there is a waiting list. Would you like to join?" Your mind would then explode to realize that there is a waiting list for a watch and that the wait times can be as long as 2, 3, or even 5 years just to get one watch. This is because Rolex doesn't care about quick sales. They want the right people to wear their timepieces, not just the wealthy. Rolex uses a unique type of stainless steel called 904L steel, which is harder, shinier, and more corrosion-resistant than regular steel. It's challenging to work with. But Rolex doesn't cut corners when it comes to handmade movements. Every Rolex movement takes months to make, not because it's slow, but because every gear and spring is assembled by hand, checked and rechecked. For true lovers of excellence, however, Rolex is like an exclusive club. The reason why Rolex watches last for decades is because they undergo years of testing under harsh conditions before allowing them to be sold. Rolex has entire buildings dedicated to research and innovation, as well as in-house labs where scientists study metals, crystals, lubricants, and even watchmaking robots. This costs millions of dollars, but it keeps Rolex ahead of the competition. Now, here's the shocking part: Rolex is one of the most adored brands on the planet. And people beg to purchase their watches. People search online, visit stores, and call dealers every day, but did you know that Rolex only produces about 1 million watches annually? You might think that sounds like a lot, but let me explain. Apple produces over 200 million iPhones annually, so if 200 million people want an iPhone, they can get one. But if 10 million people want a Rolex, only 1 million will get one, and 9 million will be disappointed. This is why demand is greater than supply, and when something is rare, it becomes more valuable. Which is what makes Rolex so powerful even after more than a century. Now, imagine this: you buy a Rolex today for $7,000, and 3 years later, someone offers you $10,000 for it. Why? Because they don't want to wait 3 years on the list, they're willing to pay more. This is why Rolex is more than just a luxury, it's an investment, just like gold, diamonds, or real estate. Some rare Rolex watches, like the Paul Newman Daytona, have sold for more than $17 million at auction. Millions of dollars for a single watch means that when people wear a Rolex, they are wearing more than just a piece of fashion, they are wearing money, history, art, and investment on their wrist. Now, let's talk about emotions. For many people, a Rolex is a dream, a goal, a reward, and more than just a gift. A woman gives herself a Rolex after enduring a difficult divorce and launching a new business. A son presents his father with a Rolex. There is a secret world of Rolex collectors who don't buy watches to wear every day. Instead, they buy, store, and admire them like people collect art or coins, knowing which model was released. On his retirement day, a wife surprises her husband with a Rolex on their 25th anniversary, hiding it under his pillow. It's not just time, it's love, respect, and achievement. Which is why Rolex is passed down from father to son and mother to daughter. Which year and which dial color are the rarest, which serial numbers are the most valuable, and which celebrity wore which watch. For some collectors, every Rolex tells a story. Rolex is worn by sports champions like Roger Federer, Tiger Woods, Tom Brady, and others. And it appears everywhere, silently and powerfully, in movies like James Bond, Titanic, and Rain Man, and in songs by Drake, Jay-Z, Eminem, and Kanye. Although Rolex never pays celebrities to wear their watches, these individuals choose Rolex because it fits with their accomplishments, style, and class. Now, you might be wondering if Rolex will survive in the world of smartwatches and technology in the future, and the answer is absolutely yes. Because Rolex is not competing with smartwatches and is not here to give you your heart rate or step count, rather, it gives you your soul. A smartwatch is like fast food, while a Rolex is like a candlelit dinner at a fine restaurant. You may be surprised to learn that Rolex is not your typical luxury brand. It is owned by the Hans Wilstow Foundation, a non-profit charity. Yes, you read correctly, the profits from Rolex are used to support scientific research, education, and the arts worldwide. Rolex doesn't have a loud CEO on Instagram who shouts, "Buy me," every second. Instead, it operates quietly and lets its watches speak for themselves. For this reason, when someone wears a Rolex, they aren't flaunting their wealth. It's not just a watch company, it's a global symbol of success, power, and timeless prestige. In 1960, Hans Wilsdorf passed away in Switzerland at the age of 79. But his dream, vision, values, and watches all survived. To this day, every time someone wears a Rolex, they are wearing a piece of history, a symbol of love, dedication, and true success. As of 2025, Rolex is worth over $11 billion, making it the most valuable luxury watch brand in the world. Of Rolex, from a modest dream in the heart of Hansville to becoming a symbol of success, discipline, and timeless excellence, Rolex is more than just a watch, it's a mindset. What we can learn from this story is that if you have a vision, protect it. If others laugh at your dreams, believe even more. If success takes time, have patience, because the world only respects what is rare, real, and unrelenting, just like Rolex. Rolex teaches us that quality will always triumph over quantity, and that success is about silence that speaks. If you enjoyed this story and want to feel inspired again, watch the Louis Vuitton success story on our channel. It's another incredible journey from poverty to power that you won't want to miss, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It's about doing your work so well that one day people will wait years just to get what you made. So, never give up even if the world doesn't see your worth. Keep building, because when the time is right, the world will watch you the way they watch Rolex, with respect, admiration, and desire. For more authentic tales that inspire and change, subscribe to our channel. Until then, keep hungry, remain modest, and never forget that your time will come.